So the first thing is about evolution, the tenets and the evidence. And we don't have time for a full-scale discussion of that, because if you think that evolutionary biology is one of the degrees you can do at Exeter University, we haven't time to do 3 years' work in an hour. I'll then think about what is loosely called creationism, but that would just get a sort of short discussion. But I think we need to air it, because it's a view that's out there. I'll then think very briefly about the Genesis text, but you had a much more full and more scholarly discussion about those yesterday, and this will be, if you like, a thoughtful biologist's take on the Genesis texts. And then thinking about the relationship between evolution and a religious understanding of creation, and then the kind of new atheist take on the way that we Christians, or other religionists, maybe Jews, maybe Muslims and so on, the take that we have on evolution and the take they have on it, and whether or not they or we are mistaken. And then there'll be some concluding thoughts and questions which will dot about all over the place. They'll be over here and over there. But first, I need to say a bit about me. On the left there's two old geezers, one's cast in bronze, the other one is me. and I'm paying homage to a great mathematician, Pythagoras, and this is in a little town on the island of Samos that is named after him, Pythagoria, because he did his work allegedly in a cave at the other end of the island. And this is me doing something that I'm more normally doing. I've just finished a mountain trek, 40 kilometers with a lot of climbing, sponsored for a Christian charity, Christians Against Poverty. This business is about sponsorship I find very strange, because I'm raising sponsorship for doing something I enjoy. You know, this wasn't exactly a chore for me. It was just a nice challenge. On a rather wet day in Yorkshire, my waterproofs have finally come off, but the bandana is still keeping the rain out of my eyes. So that's a sort of, that's me. And I want to say a little bit about me, because it will, if you like, demonstrate my take on evolution. I grew up in a working class home. Americans would say blue-collar home maybe, in South London, in the kind of born just at the end of the war, the Second World War, and so growing up at a time when Britain was recovering from that period, right on the edge of London's green belt, and grew up with an intense love of what we then called nature. And because the family was relatively financially poor, we had no car, and so we would walk in the countryside most Sunday afternoons. So I grew up with this intense love of nature, which turned into me doing a degree in natural sciences here, and then a PhD in biochemistry. And it was a Christian working class home, and my parents had a straightforward, simple faith that shone through everything they did, which was kind of catching. But you know, they had left school in their mid-teens, and so there were no great debates about evolution and creation and so on, and what was right and what was wrong. So I didn't encounter evolution until I was in high school, when we had a very good course when I was about 12 or 13, and we were introduced to the idea that organisms are adapted to their environments, and we had to put little mini projects on them. And that was the first time I'd come across evolution. But interestingly, as I developed as a scientist and slowly as somebody with a religious faith, it never occurred to me that there was a problem. It really never occurred to me. And I can remember, you know, maybe at the age of 15, with my immature understanding of evolution and my immature faith, talking to someone of not yet having faith, just explaining to him, well, of course you wouldn't have written those chapters of Genesis in modern terms. They would never have understood it. This was just stuff that they could understand and follow. And I was happy with that. And we're going to come back to those Genesis texts later. So it wasn't really until Marge and I moved to South Wales from Nottingham with our two little boys that we encountered strong adherence to an anti-evolution standpoint. And so if you like, my background here has coloured the way I approach the stuff. But I needed to say that so you can see how my ideas started off as kind of very immature germ of ideas. So, on the way through, you know, light travels faster than sound, so you saw the cloud before you heard the explosion. I just wanted this is a very good way of waking people up at 4 in the afternoon. I just also want to explode a few false ideas that have grown up around, particularly about Darwin and religion, and they've been also very nicely exploded by Dennis and by Nick Spencer in their book Rescuing Darwin. But I'm going to explode one or two of those ideas through as we go through as well. Now, as we think about evolution, we need to think a little bit about nature of science, and I'm not going to go deeply into the philosophy of science at all, but I think we just need to explore one or two main tenets. An investigation of the natural world, it's based on our human curiosity about it, but it has clear societal dimensions. I'm not one of those people who thinks that science is free from social constructs. The very fact that I've been paid for all those years to work on DNA is an indication that society thinks that's been worth paying for in some way. So there are social constructs about the science we do and about the reasons we do it. But we do assume there's something out there. This is not a postmodern position. We assume there's something out there to be discovered, and we seek to approach that reality. And John Paul Finkelman quoted my favourite philosopher of science last night, Michael Pogliani, talking about very similarly to we approach step by step and never probably ever get there to what actually is. And we do it by observation, measurement and experiment, what we call empirical methods, the methods by which we can investigate the physical world. And that's what I think I'm doing. But there are things that science can't tell us. It's a major assumption to assume that there is nothing else. The idea there is nothing else it sits quite comfortably on the philosophy of David Hume, and I think it's sometimes summed up, if you can't count it, it doesn't count. That's a sort of summary of positivism, but it's a huge assumption. And that leads me to ask, are science and faith incompatible? Now, in my view, they represent different sorts of knowledge, different ways of looking for truth. But those ways are more than compatible. They are, in fact, mutually supporting. And so my view is that true religion that's based on thought and evidence and good science have got nothing to fear from each other. The methods of science are incapable of denying the truths of religion, and I've heard Bill Newsom say that in relation to neuroscience a number of times. And if you're a Christian or a Jew or somebody of the Islamic faith, if you're privileged to work in science, the findings of science give you an awesome insight into the work of the Creator. Also give you some very puzzling insights, and we'll look at some of the more puzzling insights later. But there are many, many examples of people who have taken that view, from Copernicus through to people like ourselves, who just have this kind of sense of awe as they find something in the lab or through their telescope or through the accelerator that lies under the Jura Mountains, that somehow they've caught a glimpse of creative activity. There's something totally astonishing if you're a researcher, when your postgrad, your postdoc are sitting there talking about her latest results, and the kind of hair on the back of your neck stands up because you know that she and you know something that nobody else yet knows. Well, God maybe, but there's something there that is so completely novel that until you go and talk about it in coffee, you're the only two that know this. And yet you also get a glimpse in that result of the Creator's work. So I like it's a crude analogy, but I like to think of knowledge as being like a rainbow, just like white light is composed of several different elements of the spectrum. And this is a rainbow over one of the most beautiful parts of Great Britain, up there in northwest Scotland. And the whole picture, the white light to work, needs to be composed of all elements. If we take one out, we get a slightly distorted view. If we look through one colour, yeah, it's pretty, but it's an incomplete view. And although the analogy doesn't hold completely, because I'm not trying to split knowledge into 7 different levels, because I think that will push the analogy too far. What I'm saying is that we have a rainbow of levels of investigation of reality, of which science is one, and religion is another. And so what is that reality we're looking at? Well, it goes out into deep space. It looks at our solar system. Here's a beautiful annular eclipse. It looks at our lovely, lovely blue planet. It looks at the fundamental building blocks of life. Here are some DNA molecules. It looks at the way those building blocks of life have developed into astonishing biodiversity. And it looks too at the way humans have emerged in the way we heard in that beautiful talk this morning. And here's a very efficient human being down at the bottom left. So everything that's there is subject to scientific investigation. And that then, having mentioned biology, leads us to evolution by natural selection. And these, of course, are the kind of the iconic images for us. There's Darwin, aged about 50, and here are some of the Galapagos finches, the Darwin's finches, that led him to think about the divergence of individual groups separated from each other, separated as breeding populations. He actually started with the tortoises. It was the tortoises that first led him to think about divergence, but their breeding cycle is a little bit slower than those of the finches, and so, if you like, the possibility of speciation, separating of the species, was not quite so observable. And Lonesome George, who's died recently, a 100-year-old tortoise, was a subspecies, but he hadn't yet diverged enough for him to be incapable of breeding with females from other subspecies. But the kind of internet dating for Lonesome George didn't seem to work. He never met somebody with whom he felt compatible. So he's died a lonesome bachelor, but he was of a particular subspecies. So it was, Darwin looked at the subspecies of tortoises first, but then realised that in the finches, when he got all the preserved bodies home, he had a much better example, because their shorter breeding cycle meant there'd been more time for divergence. And so his key points were that within a species there is variation, and that's something that we biologists, it's kind of built into our persona, that's something that we accept about living things. And when I look out at human populations, it's confirmed to me instantly. And I know that in terms of single nucleotide polymorphisms and other mutations, we are actually quite similar to each other, but the phenotypes that produces give an immense array of beautiful, beautiful variation. So there's the variation, and we find in a given environment, some of those variants will be better suited to that environment than others, and that's what first, as I said, my very, very good high school teacher first introduced me to. If we looked at a group of birds, we found that they were particularly suited to maybe being wading birds or maybe being water birds. And that's how I first learned about evolution, was being suited to the environment. So a variant here, there may be we may come across an environment one day when people with red hair are very, very much favoured reproductively for some unknown reason. And so suddenly what would happen, or slowly what would happen, is that they would enjoy a greater success and would increase in numbers. They would have a greater reproductive success. And that's what Darwin observed about the variance in, for example, the Darwin's finches. A greater reproductive success. Now, I think we need to define that very carefully. It's not an all or nothing procedure. That greater reproductive success might be quite slight. It might be that in one environment, variant A has 5 young, and in another environment, variant A only has 4 young. That is enough to give an advantage, producing more offspring in a given environment than in another environment. It doesn't have to be huge. Sometimes it is, of course, much more marked than that, but it doesn't have to be huge. And so eventually, the more successful variant will dominate, and I think that's what we were hearing in Carol's talk this morning, is that it was, if you like, the demography, the population dynamics of Homo sapiens that finally crowded out Homo neanderthalis. So the more successful reproductively variant will eventually dominate and may indeed displace all others. Now, if the populations are separate, if variant A on island A and variant B on island B are not interbreeding, then that will lead them to become so separate they become species. And we can see speciation happening today. So those are the keys to Darwin's theory, and it was really threading together a huge amount of data from many, many different sources that led to these set of tenets, which I can just summarize in this way. I mean, this is really a kind of a quick overview of where Darwin was coming from. And there was evidence. And I've talked about the evidence of the Darwin's finches. He couldn't observe the pioneer population arriving from Ecuador in some way, but he deduced what had happened from looking at the current picture. And so the initial evidence did come from studies of ecology and morphology, and not just of Darwin's finches, but as he investigated many, many more examples. Exploitation of niches by particular variants, characteristics that aided that exploitation, reproductive success and wastage. All these were part of the evidence that Darwin adduced to reach his hypothesis. And then there was the fossil record with succession. And I know that the fossil record has great gaps in it still, but we are filling it in. And if we go back to his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and incidentally, if ever you're in Lichfield, do go and visit the Cathedral Close and the House of the Vicar's Coral and the Erasmus Darwin Museum. He was a doctor in Lichfield. And talking about the fossil record, 2 generations earlier, he wrote an absolutely diabolically terrible poem, which nevertheless captures some of the tenets of evolutionary theory. And so 2 generations earlier, people were already talking about the possibility, based on the fossil record, of evolutionary processes. But then, of course, we can do unnatural selection. You know, we can impose selective pressures on things in breeding. And Darwin was very interested in pigeons and in dogs, and showed that, you know, if you imposed a selection on a variant, making it more successful because that's what you wanted, then you very quickly got divergence. And although we treat all dogs as the same species, I think the interbreeding barriers between a Chihuahua and an Irish Wolfhound, unless you're using IVF, are really quite profound. And so that's the sort of thing that can happen. The divergence you get in natural selection can introduce breeding barriers that are not specifically genetic, even though they result from the genetics of the organism. And Darwin was very interested in pigeons and dogs, and they helped him to understand how selection could lead to particular variants being favoured and other variants not being favoured. So that was all part of the picture. But we need to update him, because one of the things that really puzzled Darwin was this variation, which clearly was important in the theory. He didn't understand how it was passed down from generation to generation. His idea was always that somehow you've got a kind of averaging of the 2 parental types, which would blend out extreme variance all the time. And so you'd always be tending towards a mediocre middle, which wouldn't be suited to other environments. How did a particular character get passed down? He was puzzled by the riddle of heredity. And you know, there's this apocryphal story about a letter from Mendel sitting on his table. I think it is apocryphal. But Mendel's work was rediscovered about 40 years later. And of course that enabled us to understand that inheritance was based in what we might call particles, sections of DNA now we would say, which do get passed from generation to generation through, in animals, the germline. And so it's not that inheritance gets blended out, it's that in inheritance we do have a particulate regulator of particular characters. And they will move on from generation to generation. Some of those characters get hidden, because as we now know that we call them recessive characters, others are dominant. But nevertheless, a particular identity for the factors of inheritance means that we don't blend out all the time. We can retain a particular character through the generations. And of course, we know as biologists, and it's almost commonplace, that each gene is potentially variable, different alleles for each locus, as we would say, allele and alternative, locus place on the chromosome. Each gene is potentially variable. Some seem to be more prone to variation than others. There seem to be hotspots for change, as we now know, but the key thing is that that of the array of genes that we contain, 26,000 odd, each one of them is capable of existing in different forms. And so we can now update Darwin to say that natural selection acts on the genetic variation within a population. And this is one of the myths I want to explode, is the idea that, you know, the environment changes and you've got to wait for a mutation before there's anything that is adapted to that environment. In general, there's enough variation in a big population to cope with changes in the environment, that there will be some variants who are already potentially more adapted. So populations, different environments select out different variants which are already in the population. I mean, we've heard today, for example, of a particular gene in humans where 67% have one allele, 33% have another allele. And you can imagine that one of those variants, were it not monoamine oxidase, one of those variants might be more suited to, or perhaps one is more suited to a prison environment, who knows? One of those variants might be more suited to a particular way that the environment was. And that is usually slow, but speciation can occur suddenly. Genetic isolation can occur in plants like overnight with a doubling of the chromosome number. And so there have been speciation events in the British flora in the last 120 years or so, several that we can identify. My colleague who has worked on adaptation of genus Mimulus to things like copper has identified a species that must have arisen when Native Americans started to mine copper in eastern California, because the copper content of the soil suddenly increased in the soil tips, and there's a species that is now adapted to them. So speciation can be quite rapid, but it also can occur very slowly. So we do need time for evolution. So a new species can be formed from a pre-existing species. We have the concept then of a common ancestor. And this was true of the Darwin's finches. And so humans, or the various homonyms that we've heard about today, have common ancestors with the great apes. And we currently think, for example, that the human lineage diverged from the great ape lineage maybe 5 million years ago, maybe slightly more. The numbers vary. And again, that is a slow process too. And the longer the generation time for each particular species, the longer will be the time it takes to distinguish and differentiate between the species, unless there's a sudden genetic isolation event. So, more evidence, we will say, genomics has been wonderful. I mean, not only can we now sequence genomes, but we can sequence genomes of organisms which we think might be related to each other. We can do that with individual genes, we can look at variants of those genes, we can look at whole genomes. And we find that when we look at species that we think have descended from a common ancestor, the evidence we get, for example, from comparing the chimpanzee with the human, fits uncannily with what we had supposed from comparative morphology and physiology. The same is true of the Darwin's finches, and if I just give you one example, that finch with the large beak has a mutation which does not switch, causes beak growth to continue longer than it would otherwise do. It's just a single gene change, and yet it's led to a finch that is able to eat rather larger seeds than others. That variant would have been selected on an island where plants bearing particular seeds were more abundant. They fit together uncannily. We could trace, one could give example after example where genomics more than confirms and undergirds the previous evidence. We can trace, for example, between the earlier apes and the chimpanzees and humans, we can trace the sudden acquisition of an extra DNA sequence, which is present in ourselves and the great apes, but not in much earlier examples. Nothing to do actually with the way we work, but it's just a sort of marker there. But I will continue to say that although we can demonstrate selection in the lab with short-lived organisms like Drosophila and bacteria, we do have to acknowledge that we cannot look back and repeat what's gone in the deep past. We are reconstructing it from present-day evidence, just as we do with the history of the universe. We reconstructed the history of the universe from evidence we adduce in the present day. But it all hangs together quite well for me as a biologist. And that leads, having mentioned the universe, that leads us to think about that other element of evolution. You do need time. Evolution takes a long time. And the current thinking is that the first living cells on this planet, about 3.6 billion years ago, and then nothing much happened. And then later on, life got an upgrade when eukaryotic cells appeared. So they're the business class cells. So the age of the Earth and the universe are consistent with evolutionary theory, and I'm not going to talk about the age of the universe and the Earth, because again, someone like Bob White would do it so much better than me, and again, you can have a whole book on it. But we can look at the geological, chemical, and physical evidence of the age of the universe, and that ties in with the amount of time we need for the development of biodiversity, ties in with the amount of time we need for biological life. But I need to say straight away, this is another one of these fallacies that I want to press that exploder on. See, when I'm talking in schools and that explosion slide, I actually get the kids to pretend they're pressing the thing to blow up an old building, and then we get the So just do that again. Where there's a lot of ideas around those opponents of evolution who say, well, you're only making up the old universe because you need the time. But actually, it was the century before Darwin that people started to think about how long it must have taken for the geological processes to have occurred. And I think it was the geologist Hutton who said, if you want to know about the age of the Earth, go to the mountains. Well, I would go to the mountains for any excuse, but that seems to be as good as one as any. Go to the mountains. The age, there was a lot of questioning that the Earth was not young before the theory of evolution came about. And I just take this opportunity to show the same scene without the rainbow. And see, these are some of the oldest rocks on the planet. These are up in northwest Scotland, and they're heavily eroded because they're so old, and the mountains of a slightly different rock type still stand out from them. It's just awesome standing there thinking these have been around for rather a long time. So we then counter that with creationism, and I put the word creationism in inverted commas because those of us who have a religious faith, part of that faith embodies the idea that God is the creator. And so there is a sense in which I'm a creationist in that particular understanding of the word. But it's become shorthand for a viewpoint that suggests that evolution is wrong, that evolution has not happened, that the Earth is not old. So YEC, Young Earth Creationism, Archbishop Usher based his timing on the genealogies in Genesis and calculated the Earth is about 6,000 years old, and he had a particular time of the afternoon in which the Earth was finished on a Friday, because Saturday was the Sabbath, sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That was presumably Greenwich Mean Time, I would assume. And in this viewpoint, the days of Genesis are taken to be successive 24-hour days. The sun and the moon are therefore very slightly younger than the Earth, because they weren't created until about day 3 or 4, which is very strange. And the kinds of living things are said to be fixed, that God created each kind, and they reproduced after their kind. And then humans became the pinnacle of God's creation. We may say that humans are the most complex organisms to have arisen by evolution, but we can put it in this way, that humans are the pinnacle of God's creation. Now that is a very clear, very, very clear, very different position on God the Creator than the one I've just taken as a biologist, that God the Creator in some way allowed or directed an evolutionary process that took place over billions of years. Here it's taken place very quickly, and not much has changed since then. And I think we need to acknowledge that there are people who think that, and I don't want to in any way denigrate their sincerity. Now, for me there are problems. I think there are problems within the text, and some of these you will have discussed yesterday, I feel sure. Problems within the text, for example, equating the account in chapter 2 with the account in chapter 1. They are not the same. The order of the creative events is not the same, and the emphasis given to humankind is somewhat different, and the role given to humankind is somewhat different. And I think now critics accept that if we look at the style of the two bits, the two chapters, it's likely that chapter 2 is an earlier text than chapter 1. And there are problems in dealing also with the scientific data. And one of the questions I always ask somebody, very gently, who holds this position, is what actually do you make of the scientific data? In radio interviews, I've had some remarkable answers, which I'll deal with later. So what about Genesis? Well, I talked about my early understanding. My early understanding was very much that, you couldn't have possibly written about genetics and evolution in an ancient world text. It would not have been possible, because there would have been complete and utter lack of understanding. You could not do it. So that was my early understanding as an immature Christian, as an immature biologist. But that's how I felt about it. But then more recently, I've come to understand that we've got to analyse biblical texts in the genre and the style in which they're written. And the genre and the style of Genesis 1 in particular is very much of an epic text. It's written in what I call poetic prose, and the structure is very much of poetic prose. And then I think we need to think of the place of Genesis in the ancient world. Other ancient world texts gave other views of the creative process, and here we have a particular view of the creation as being the work of somebody who did it deliberately, who cared for it and produced humankind as part of that process, not as a byproduct of gods fighting each other, not part of a kind of hierarchy of gods, one proving its worth by creating something which frightened the others. This was a deliberate event, or set of events, by a caring God, leading to the appearance of humankind. And I think I now understand that in ancient world terms, we are seeing the whole of creation as the temple of God, and humanity is described in Judaism, in Islam, and in Christianity as bearing God's image, the image of God. And this is a kind of reference to what used to happen when land was conquered. The images of the conquering king were left, so that people knew whose land they were in. And the last thing to go into a temple was an icon of the god. And here we have a living icon. It seems to me that humanity is God's image, God's icon in this temple, which is his universe. It's really quite an awesome responsibility. And I find that particular image, which is now being pursued by several theologians, I find that quite inspiring. But it's an ancient world text written for a world of that time. And I like to think that Genesis describes the who of creation. The who is God, and the who is also humankind, with this particular role we've got. And science talks about the how of creation, the unwinding over billions of years. And we're not alone in thinking these things. This is an early Christian thinker. Who will suppose, said Origen, that the first and second and third day and the evening and the morning existed without a sun and moon and stars, and that the first day was, as it were, also without a sky? So Origen is already questioning whether we should use Genesis 1 as a kind of journalistic, I prefer to say that than literal, journalistic view of what happened. And then a little bit later, Augustine, in the beginning were created only the germs of causes of life, which were afterwards to be developed by gradual course. He had quite an insight in the creative process. He understood that, although he wouldn't have put it this way, that time and space were part of the same continuum, and so the creation of the universe involved the creation of time as well. So we're not alone in thinking these things, which leads me then to think about evolution and religion. And again, remember, I'm thinking mainly from a Judeo-Christian point of view. And I want to say that Darwin's theory was not universally rejected by the church, and that's been made very clear for example, in Dennis's little book. We may have read that it was, but it wasn't. Many Jews and Christians accepted it. The infamous Wilberforce-Huxley debate, for those of you who don't know, that just shortly after the publication of the book, there was the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which is now called the British Science Association, had a meeting in Oxford in which Bishop Wilberforce, known as Sophie Sam, debated with Huxley, who became known as Darwin's bulldog, whereas Dawkins we know as Darwin's Rottweiler, had a debate about it. And you get the impression, again, reading secular texts, that that Wilberforce had been thoroughly defeated by Huxley. But reading the accounts at the time, that is not so. That each of the speakers had their supporters, and the general conclusion was that there was no conclusion. That they had each done well and they'd each done badly. And Huxley was not arguing against religion. He was trying to professionalize biology. He was trying to remove biology from the hands of many of the amateurs who were pursuing biology, which included Wilberforce, who was a bishop and also a bit of a scientist, Sophie Sam, he became known as. So it was really a debate that was focused on evolution as a lightning rod. And neither side got really defeated, although I think one would say that some of Wilberforce's debating points were a little bit scurrilous. So what actually happens now is that many religious believers in those three great Abrahamic faiths think that evolution is just an amazing set of mechanisms through which, and the term "through which" is deliberately vague. I'm not saying that God has set it going like a watchmaker and step back, and I'm not saying that he's tweaking every single gene mutation for reasons that I'll come to in a few minutes. Through which, those are the mechanisms by which biodiversity has arisen, including humans. So that is the current mainstream view in mainstream religion in Britain, for example. But I'd like to do some more myth exploding by listening to Darwin himself, through his letters and through what he said at different times during the debate. Talking of Wilberforce's speech, which you may remember, secular press would have us that evolution was won and Wilberforce was discredited. He believed that Wilberforce's speech was clever because it pointed out the weaknesses of the hypothesis, things that needed more work. And that's something that we scientists should always be grateful for, looking for the weaknesses in our theories. Things where you need to do more work. So, Wilberforce pointed out the conjectures and the difficult bits. And then about God, I cannot be contented to view this wonderful universe, and especially the nature of man, and to conclude that everything is the result of brute force. So let's contrast with Richard Dawkins. The existence of the universe just has to be taken as brute fact. Not brute force. So maybe Dawkins isn't Darwin's Rottweiler. Now I need to say that this wasn't a Christian faith. It was a kind of deistic faith. There was a God there who was kind of out there but remote. And we've alluded to suffering briefly already today, and it'll come back in a few minutes. Darwin had lost his Christian faith because his favourite daughter Anna, had died. But I want to explode another myth here. That loss of Christian faith did not set him at enmity with the priest in his village down near Bromley. They remained friends for life. The film Creation gave the impression that they fell out, but they didn't. They had immense respect for each other. So more from Darwin. And he's talking now about on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And I can't, just like Richard Dawkins, I can't remember the rest of the title, it's very long. And he's been criticised by an Oxford theology don, Dr. Pusey. Dr. Pusey was mistaken in imagining that I wrote The Origin with any relation whatever to theology. He wasn't in any way saying that God was or wasn't involved. This was a science book. I should have thought this would have been evident to anyone who's taken the trouble to read the book. So, what about now? Well, we live in interesting times, and the social context for this discussion is important. And the world, particularly in Britain, maybe less so in the United States, but particularly in Britain and in other parts of Northern Europe, is highly secularized. So here's Martin Newland, the Guardian correspondent, writing now nearly 6 years ago, but what he says there is still true. I'm a Catholic, I'm also sane. Roman Catholic, Christian believer. People find it hard to accept that religion and rationality can coexist, and some of the new atheists actually take that line. You must be stupid if you're religious. You can't be rational. So that view is out there. And then in terms of talking about Darwin, this is my colleague John Dupre, who is the professor of the philosophy of biology. His book, Darwin's Legacy, What Evolution Means Today, he rejects, incidentally, he rejects totally scientific genetic determinism and essentialism, but nevertheless writes this. And for a philosopher to write that, I find extraordinary. Darwinism undermines the only remotely plausible reason believing in God. What does he think religious people believe for? Absolutely extraordinary. He thinks we're all God of the gaps people, and if you can fill a gap, then God is gone. I just find it extraordinary that a philosopher can write that in a bestseller. Very strange. And then we have Richard Dawkins, who is a genetic determinist, a genetic essentialist, as I've written down here, reductionist. We can be reduced to a bag of genes and we're determined by them, except he also believes in agency, which is very strange. And so we are determined by our genes, we dance to its tune, it has no purpose, as he wrote in River Out of Eden, but nevertheless, in The Blind Watchmaker, he also said we are privileged as humans to be able to override our genes. And I'm thinking you can't have it both ways, mate. So here's some quotes from Richard. Those who say Darwin is compatible with Christian belief may be sincere, but they're mistaken. We have evidence to support evolution, but none to support belief in the deity. I don't know how far he's looked. So let's go back to Darwin. It seems to me to be absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. Rather convoluted way of saying, of course you can believe in evolution and God at the same time. No problem. In my most extreme fluctuations, I've never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God. So this is the person who is supposed to have pulled the planks up from religious belief. So a few myths exploded. So what about God? Does evolution enhance or diminish our understanding of God? How do we understand the Bible? What do the early chapters of Genesis say? Is the Bible a textbook of mechanisms? I've alluded to some of those questions on the way through. And I'm reminded, in terms of the last question, of Pierre-Simon Laplace. Je n'avais pas besoin de cette hypothèse-là. He didn't say that, but it's a very nice, it's an apocryphal. I have no need of that hypothesis. He'd written a book about the way the universe worked, and it is supposed that Emperor Napoleon said, you didn't mention God. And Laplace replied that, I have no need of that hypothesis. He didn't mean that he's rejecting the existence of God. He meant, I'm describing the mechanisms, man. You don't put God into the mechanisms. When I'm talking about the replication of DNA, God doesn't appear in every sentence. You don't need the God hypothesis to describe the mechanisms. But the Bible is not a textbook of scientific mechanisms. It's about other stuff altogether. And the same is true of the Holy Quran. So evolution religion today, we scientists think that evidence for evolution is overwhelming. And I think a majority of mainstream believers in the United Kingdom and Europe in general would accept evolution, but it may be different in the USA. And there is a minority. And this is what I wanted to talk about. I always challenge people who discuss this with me. What do you then make of the scientific data? And the commonest is that you misinterpreted the data. That you've assumed things about the uniformity of natural causes without any reason for doing so. Or that the data you've obtained, despite the sophistication of your experimental methods, are wrong. But I've even been told on a particular Christian radio station that scientists make up the data in order to keep us on the atheist track, which is very interesting. One example of the misinterpretation of the data came when I was speaking at the meteorological office. That's our big weather station, our weather forecasting place down in Exeter, to their Christian group. And I was speaking on the 200th anniversary of the birth of Darwin, so it was his birthday. And there was clearly, one of the managers of the Met Office, not a scientist, was clearly a six-day creationist, and we had quite a heated debate in the question time. But then I went to lunch with two of my scientist friends, and one of them told me he had a 500,000-year-old ice core in his freezer from the Antarctic, 500,000 years old. If you count down 6,000 years, you've hardly touched the ice core. And the question then, you really have to question seriously what these data mean. What are the other many thousands of years? What are you going to say about them if you hold to a young Earth position? And there's a bit of, there's some wriggling to be done here. So I always go back to that can you explain what this appearance of age is all about? And we could say the same about the light coming from the far corners of the universe, except it wouldn't be 500,000, it would be 13.7 billion. Now here's a quick cultural side trip about evolution. Before, I want to show a little movie at the end, but here's a cultural side trip showing how evolution of humankind is very strongly related to environmental factors. On the right we have einkorn wheat, wild. And it was a mutation, a single genetic change in einkorn wheat that made the seeds, the grains, stay on the head rather than on the ground. And so you could grow them and harvest them. You no longer had to gather them. And this is said to be, this single mutation is said to be a major factor in the establishment of human agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. The one genetic change in einkorn. And here's the cultivated version on the left. And I know there's a lot of discussion about the transition from hunter-gatherer to agrarian communities. But they certainly did need grains where they could harvest without scrubbing about on the ground. And I like to think that the evolution of a wheat plant has had a quite profound effect on human communities. But here's another example. This was mentioned this morning, I think, wasn't it? And I had this slide already in here, that culture affects our evolution. Now, I've actually picked out Africans. So these are people who've not left Africa. And you can see here that the guys, this is the amount of this lactase protein. Lactase is a gene that in its original situation would be switched off at the end of weaning. And so what we have here is persistence of infantile lactase into the adult state. And you can see that the yellow lines are the African groups which are pastoralists and they keep cattle and they drink dairy products and stuff. And the blue lines are those that are not pastoralists. And yet there's some variation, but on the whole, if you're a pastoralist and you have dairy products, you have a much higher level of persistence of infantile lactase, and it's very similar to the picture you showed, but with a different group of people. But here's one that my students are more interested in. Is alcohol dehydrogenase. and there is again variation in human populations, and probably the original natural selection of alcohol dehydrogenase was probably because of fermentation happening in the gut flora. So we were producing alcohol. And then we find that scientists, societies and groups with long history of drinking alcohol have high levels of ADH. And variation between societies, between men and women, and some ethnic groups which have not had a long history of drinking alcohol have lower ADH levels. Professor Steve Jones often says that humans have stopped evolving, and it may well be that now we do, because of medical care, that people with quite serious genetic mutations do indeed live long enough to reproduce. But in terms of things like culture and diet, it seems to me that we can still evolve, just from these examples. But there's a dark side. And I think we cannot ignore this. The genetic changes that lead to variation can be beneficial, or they can be neutral, or they can be harmful, and that's the way that genetic variation works. And so the genetic variation that has enabled evolution to take place also produces cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia. Incidentally, these are the two commonest genetic birth defects in the United Kingdom. It used to be just cystic fibrosis, because it's definitely a Caucasian stroke Celtic mutation. But now we've had so much immigration from the Indian subcontinent, from the West Indies and from Africa, that sickle cell anemia now equals it in terms of birth defects. And these are equally part of genetic variation, and I think we just need to say that that is tough stuff, and the suffering of somebody with cystic fibrosis is not to be dismissed. And we might want to compare that with our violent Earth, with the volcanoes and the movement of the tectonic plates, which regenerate the Earth in a very real way. And Tom Wright, who Americans will know as N.T. Wright, former Bishop of Durham and now Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at St Andrews, says, well, I guess a tectonic plate has to do what a tectonic plate has to do, and you know, it's an awful throwaway line, but a gene's got to do what a gene's got to do, and I think we've got to live with that. And if we believe in a caring God, nevertheless, the evolutionary process throws up these things, and you can't have just good mutations. That's not how it works. So I want to, having talked about that, I want to show a short video clip from the Test of Faith website. Get down to the Test of Faith website, www.testoffaith.com. There's a double F in the middle, Test of Faith, it makes it look a Welsh word. And there's loads of resources that you can download and show. And this is this really discusses whether random mutations, in the way we've just talked about, can ever lead to something purposeful like humankind. So this is Ard Lewis, who's physicist biophysicist at Oxford, and Simon Conway Morris, who's Professor of Evolutionary Biology here in Cambridge, talking about this.
Do we come to be here by the act of a creator, or the random throw of a dice? One scientist believer says we need to ask what we mean by the word random.
The way that we think about random in the day-to-day life, which is purposelessness, is very different from the scientific way of thinking about random, which means that basically it's something unpredictable about the microscopic details of what's happening. But then the overall process may still be very predictable and very beautiful. And so I think that evolution, in many ways, is the same thing. Evolution is a random optimizer, and it's probably the very best way of finding the solutions in biological space that we now call you and me.
But the question remains whether any real pattern can be detected in evolution.
The general received wisdom is that evolution is completely open-ended. It can go in any direction you like. And at first sight that seems entirely reasonable, because biology, evolution, seems to be largely without any underlying laws. So leading from that, there is then a metaphysical assumption which says that all things are equally probable, but also everything is accidental. It could be this, it could be that. Whereas my view is actually, well, the exact reverse, that the roads of evolution are well defined, and evolution can go in only a very few directions in comparison to the immense plenitude which the neo-Darwinian would suggest.
Professor Simon Conway Morris says he can back up this claim. He's pioneered research in a field called evolutionary convergence.
Effectively, it is arguing that from different starting positions, some sort of structure emerges which is remarkably similar. In other words, I go to an aquarium, I see an octopus in the tank. I look at the octopus and she glances back at me. The eye in my head is constructed on what we call a camera principle. The eye in the octopus head is constructed effectively the same way. It's also a camera eye. Now, we know enough from molecular biology and the fossil record and evolution generally that the common ancestor, indeed we do have a common ancestor with the octopus, lived about 500 million years ago in the Cambrian, could not possibly have possessed that sort of camera eye. So independently, the ancestors of the octopus, the ancestors of Simon Conway Morris, generation by generation, evolved a system which is extremely effective for seeing, called the camera eye. So that's just one example of convergence. It goes a bit further than that, because this camera eye has actually evolved independently, I think, about 7 times. So you almost get the sense that there are stable points in biological space towards which things can navigate.
But is this another scientist claiming science can prove God?
Emphatically, I would not say, here's convergence, this is a proof of anything. In fact, it merely says that the world is structured, and then you must stand back from that position and say, well, why is the world structured in the way it is? And if there are claims made by particular religious traditions, are they themselves in any way congruent with those world pictures?
Nice. This little logo is the Test of Faith logo down the bottom. You'll see that if you go on the website. Okay, some final thoughts. Why does it matter? Well, it matters to scientists, I think, this idea of evolution, because we need to be true to ourselves, but also true to our vocation. And our vocation as scientists is that I put up at the beginning, that we are trying to approach an objective truth about reality, by this process, verisimilitude, by what we do. And that approach has led us as a community to understand that biodiversity has arisen by a process of evolution by natural selection. So we've been true to ourselves and to our vocation. Our vocation is to seek for truth at that particular level. That particular part of the rainbow is what we are called to do. But I think we also need to ask, how do we relate to those with whom we disagree? And especially if they are our co-religionists, if we are speaking Christian to Christian, or Jew to Jew, or Muslim to Muslim, people who share our faith. How do we accommodate these differences? They're quite profound if you're a scientist. Maybe outside the realm of science, it's not quite so important. And perhaps there needs to be some sort of feeling that, okay, charitably I would accept that people are not coming along with me here, but it is important to me, in being true to myself and the vocation that God has given me. Thank you very much.
Has a question.
Yes. Should I stand up? Or
Yeah.
Oh, yes, please.
This is the hard bit.
So, I want to ask a question about just one sentence from the paper, which is, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, which I wouldn't dream of disputing. But I have a question about exactly what's meant by that. That is, does the word evolution or evolution in this sentence stand for a phenomenon? That is something that's out there in the world, like gravity or photosynthesis or radioactivity, or does it stand for a theory, say the theory that Darwin proposed? That is, I think, either use is defensible, but it's in physics, say, you wouldn't find somebody using the word gravity in a way where it might refer to a phenomenon or also to the general theory of relativity.
Well, yeah, I would agree. I mean, I tend to think of evolution as more of a paradigm, if you like. It's an overarching way of thinking about biological systems, and it's more than an hypothesis. It kind of undergirds much of the way in which we think about and investigate the natural world. It is true that you could be an experimental biologist in some areas without accepting that paradigm, that way of thinking about things, but I would say you would have to confine your approach to a very, very kind of here and now mechanistic understanding of what you were looking at. So it's very difficult to distinguish or to define, but I think it is a paradigm, a way of thinking. I don't know if Dennis wants to come back on that one, because he's also thought about this a lot. Are we thinking about, we're not thinking about a detailed individual theory here, it's much more like several theories rolled into one big umbrella.
But is it a thing or is it a set of statements?
Is it a thing or is it a set of statements?
Well,
I think it's a set of processes. A set of
That's a
processes.
thing.
Okay, that's a thing.
yes, I mean, people believed in evolution,
Explanation.
from Lamarck
for a long time without believing in Darwinian evolution. So I think it also depends very much on what label, doesn't it, you put in the front. So then you can talk about the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and you're referring actually to a different theory, which didn't really come about to the 1920s and 1930s.
Yes, so synthesis is another important word here, because it is a drawing together of many different threads.
Isn't it an explanation, though, for a whole lot of data?
Then it's a set of statements.
Exactly.
I always try to avoid the word explanation. But,
Okay. Thanks.
Just related to that, I normally try to understand like in two different things. One is kind of the paths or the path of evolution, and another thing is the mechanism for evolution. So one thing is to affect evolution as a process that has happened. And
okay, that's a process, yes.
Another thing is using Darwinism as an explanation why it happens and how it is happening.
Okay.
And in this side, you can have different explanations. Darwinism is one, Lamarck's was other, and you can imagine post-Darwinian explanation.
Okay, so you have a process that is driven by a set of mechanisms. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I like the way you put it.
You may criticize, for example, Darwinism and imagine a more complicated explanation or alternative explanation, and still try to explain the same set of data, the evolution, the history of life.
Okay, yes. Thank you.
I have a little bit of a problem with the way that we think about God. And I think
as we discussed at breakfast this morning, yes.
and as a Christian, I'm trying to get some, I don't want to say sympathy, but the problem I have with the way that you look at God is that you look at God as anthropomorphic, as a form of person.
How do you know the way I look at God? I was trying to.
Well, because you're talking about God as a person, you're talking about him doing this and doing that.
Only because that's the convenient language we use. We talk about God as male because that's traditional. I sometimes say God, he, she, or it.
Okay, but the trouble with certainly not so much in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, you've got John saying God is love. And I think if you look at God in spiritual terms, you get yourself much less tied up in worrying about what you're experiencing, and you get far more concerned about what you're expressing, because when Philip comes to Jesus and says, "Show us the Father," he says, "You're looking at him." But what is it that Jesus is showing? What is it Philip is being asked to look at? Is the love, the sincerity, the peace, the joy, all those things. And although the human world and the physical world is extremely interesting, what makes it dynamic, from my sense, is spirituality. The joy, the peace, and the harmony. And I'm going to throw in something which I know you're not going to like very much, but anybody's interested, I will let you have an account of the healing of a woman who adopted a 7-month-old child with no vocal cords and with cerebral palsy. But by the time this child was 17 years old, he was completely healed of all those things. Now, there is no physical explanation for that, but there is a spiritual explanation for it. And that's why I have problems with a God who acts like a person, and I have far less problems with you seeing mankind in the sense is what is our identity? If we look at our identities, instead of being corporeal and anthropomorphic, if we look at our identities in terms of love, then we have a rationale for our immortality, rather than being concerned about our mortality and our lack of spirituality. And I think that's the real place where I start to have a problem with being obsessed with evolution.
Okay.
I'm not obsessed with evolution. I'm obsessed with DNA altogether. It's my favourite molecule. Caffeine is my second.
C2H5OH.
Well, there's that as well. Yes. Alcohol dehydrogenase. I will come back here and say, in the beginning was the Word. So there's another description. The Word was with God, and the Word was God, and by Him were all things created. So, that's another way of thinking about God, and I think that, we use language which is convenient to what we're talking about, but we try to define God, we try to describe Him, her, or it. We cannot put God in a box, and so we're using language that might be appropriate for the topic on which we're speaking.
Thank you. Yeah.
I know that you have been dealing with creationists and people of various views with regard to evolution for many years.
Yes.
Many more years than I have, and yet I am already at the end of my rope. And I used to spend a lot of time and energy trying to craft responses to people, whether they be in emails or in letters at the end of a Christian magazine or something like that. And now I just don't bother to do it anymore, and I just put certain emails into a little, what I call my blacklist, But I don't really feel bad about these people too much, but I feel bad about the emails, let's just say that. But so I want to know how you keep your sunny demeanor about these things and a continual willingness to talk about these things and interview on them and relate to them.
My sunny demeanour is a result of my genes, my environment, and my development. I don't know. I think sometimes that I've been endued with a great gift of patience. It's the unsung Christian virtue of patience, and I mean sometimes what has been directed against me has been quite vicious, and I just try to deflect it with love. And there was an occasion when I was debating in one of these Christian under canvas festivals, tent full of people, and I and my colleague were really quite viciously attacked by the anti-evolution people on the other side of the table. I didn't want there to be a vote because I thought it was divisive, but the chair insisted, and in fact pro-evolution won by about 10-1, but I suspect it was our demeanour that won, not the strength of our argument. I think it is all about love, and I'm not going to stand up here and make myself out to be a great demonstrator of agape, but I think sometimes you just have to say, okay guys, that's where you're coming from. I sincerely accept what you say, but I think you're wrong, in as sunny a way as you possibly can.
Peter.
You said at a certain moment that God allows or directs evolution.
Well, I said through which. I was trying ever so hard not to. I was trying to steer somewhere near John Polkinghorne, maybe. I mean, it's very hard. If we start saying that God directs, as if to say we're going to do that mutation now because that's going to take us one step nearer to humankind, you cannot avoid saying God also flicks that switch, and hey presto, there's a baby with cystic fibrosis. So I think actually it's a little bit more hands off than that. That we have a much more open process. I don't know if Carl was coming here with a sort of.
Not quite yet, but I think your balancing is very helpful because you can't. Otherwise, you do get caught up in people questioning why bad things happen.
Because otherwise, you say, God inflicted cystic fibrosis on my child. What happens to be? Which I have heard said about things. But,
Yeah. Thank you, John. That's helpful.
More questions? Yes.
I think when we look generally at the process of evolution and our general or rational understanding of religion, they are compatible with each other. So in that sense there is no problem. But the problem is that sometimes you have got specific statements or quotes from your religious text, and they are in conflict with it. So generally they are compatible. So how do you deal with specific things? You didn't tell us much about that, about God created in 1 day, 2 days. You may need to interpret it.
Yeah, I mean, you had a much better talk about that yesterday.
Yeah. So are you going to bring that into...
So what I'm saying is that I do not. You've mentioned the 1, 2, 3 day. I mean, if even Origen didn't accept it, then that was questioning way back in the 2nd century. But no, I think we do need to understand the setting of a particular text, to whom it was written, the level of understanding that was around at that time, and the genre of literature, and for me, Genesis 1 is demeaned by thinking of it as a piece of journalism. The guy standing out there on the edge of the universe. Okay, God's now made the sun. I'll just put that down. I'm sure it's not meant, I think, to be a piece of journalism. It's bringing us truth in another form of literature. Just as a great poem can bring us truth in another form of literature. I've just been recently very moved by a short poem by the Welsh priest and poet R.S. Thomas, talking about the pearl of great price. But he describes it in completely different terms, of the sunlight falling on a field. So poetry will bring us truth. And although Genesis 1 is not a poem, it's nevertheless written in a particular structure that indicates it's a special sort of prose. It's not the historical, journalistic prose you get, shall we say, later on in the book, which describes the journeyings of Abraham and then so on, and the captivity of the people in Israel, and then the Exodus. That's written very, very much in this happened, this happened, this happened sort of way. So I think we need to understand each book of the Bible in the genre, the type of literature that it is.
Yes.
I know, sorry, just going back to another topic. I know you were talking about the different ways that people who do believe in a 6,000-year-old Earth reject the scientific evidence.
Yes.
And I've heard another explanation that like God could have created not a new Earth but an old Earth.
Yes.
With these things, I was just wondering how you respond to that.
Well, that particular viewpoint is that we've misinterpreted the data, because actually what happened was that the universe was created to appear as if it was old. I mean, the stars are so far away, and knowing about the speed of light, that either God has arranged it so that the light to arrive long before it should, as well as those neutrinos travelling under the tunnel in Italy.
That was all wrong.
or those stars are indeed very old, and so the sort of viewpoint you've been talking about is that God somehow arranged for the physics of the universe to make it look as if it was old. And in a radio debate, I had that position put to me by the person with whom I was debating. I find it very difficult, because if we do believe that God can be approached personally, and that there is, in some sense, he has a care, or she has a care, or it has a care for us humans, then it seems to me to be very strange that the universe will have been made to deceive us, because that's exactly what it would be. That if the universe has been made to look like it's 13.7 billion years old, when it's only 6,000 years old, that is a very strange thing to do. Now, we can't speak for God, and perhaps we'll find out one day, but the person chairing this debate was the chaplain of Plymouth University, and she was so unable to contain her surprise at what my protagonist said that she whistled between her teeth, which came out in the broadcast. It's really the only way of dealing with the data. We don't make them up, and in terms of everything we know about the laws of nature, we are not misinterpreting them according to the laws. And so the only way you can get around that is to say that in some way the laws of nature have been changed by the Creator to make it look as if they're old. There's one member of my church who thinks that the universe has been made to look old. And Adam was born as a young man.
It goes back to Philip Goss in the 19th
yes,
century,
it does,
doesn't it?
It does.
This
Did
idea.
Adam have a neighbour?
Yes, that question.
Yes.
Yes.
assuming that God laid down, or the Creator laid down the processes of mechanism of evolution, did he lay down enough material and process to guarantee the advent of Homo sapiens that will give him the glory? First question. And how did he guarantee that the process would eventually lead to the birth of Jesus Christ?
I can't.
Or is the Jesus event outside the paradigm of evolutionary process?
Well, once you've got humans, then that gives you the possibility of a human representing God. So, but you've got to have humans first. But maybe if there'd been another intelligent life form instead of humans, Jesus would have come in that form. There's a lot of discussion. Simon Conway Morris talked there about evolution having particular, if you like, finishing places or particular staging posts to which you go convergently. And the big question then would be that if you rolled it again, and this is the question often asked by Stephen Jay Gould, if you rolled it again, would intelligent beings emerge? Given the time we have, his answer is probably yes. Then would they be like humans? And his answer is, we do not know. I mean, carbon-based life does pose some imposition on the way that we work. That there's an awful lot that is prescribed by the fact that we are carbon-based life. Once you've got that, would intelligent beings look like little green persons, or would they look like us? And it also raises questions about exobiology, which I think Janet's going to talk about. If intelligent life has risen in far, far galaxies, would they be like us? The answer is, I don't know. I wouldn't dream of speaking for God here. That he, she, or it had in their mind structures like this. I don't know. All I know is that we are here.
He presumably had the intention of bringing about
An
intelligent creatures with moral responsibility and all
to represent him as his icon.
But we could have been biologically, somewhat different.
Somewhat different, yes.
How about the Jesus event?
The Jesus event. I mean, theologically, we said the Jesus event was part of rescuing this intelligent being from the path down which it had chosen to go, of rejecting its creator. But the Jesus event, as we know it, needed to take place within humanity. But supposing an intelligent being had arisen with completely different morphology, the Jesus event would have presumably taken place in that morphology.
No.
Young Earth creationism, for its faults, doesn't claim any scientific evidence to back it up. It claims scriptural authority, the authority of God, etc., but no scientific evidence. Intelligent design does claim scientific evidence, even when its claims other people would describe as, would say, are false, like the claim of some intelligence design advocates that there is no mechanism for the evolution of the human eye, or that a bacterial flagella is irreducible into its constituent parts. So how do you respond to intelligent designers who come at you with the language of science rather than the language of scriptural authority, that perhaps there is no, it's much harder to counteract because they can just declare that it is?
Yeah, well, I produced my ballpoint pen as an example of irreducible complexity, and then I showed that every single piece of it could be used for something else except for the very special ink that was invented for it. And that's the bacterial flagellum story. It's the human immunosystem story. In every case we find that you can assemble complex structures from pre-existing structures. And looking at, just as an example, looking at the way that different genes are used by different organisms in different ways, even though, if you like, it's the same protein, shows us that developmental processes are much more plastic than the intelligent design movement would have. So I don't think that we get to a position where something is irreducibly complex. And the eye is a lovely case because you could trace, for example, a light-sensitive spot. You could then think about how that might have been focused. You can then think about putting some material in front of it to increase the to increase the power of decision between different points near each other, and so on. So I think the eye is not a very good example of intelligent design. So in most cases, the bits and pieces have already had a purpose somewhere else.
And with the eye, as we had from Simon Conway Morris, evolved a number of different times independently.
Seven times the camera.
The one type of eye, yes. Right.
So I want to develop this a little bit further and return to what Peter was discussing, the question of what do you mean by evolution. I mean, I think you put forward a very clear exposition of the principles of common descent by means of natural selection.
Yeah, that would
when
be very
people
dominant.
use the word evolution, a lot of people, particularly some of the militant atheists of the day, mean a lot more than that. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why, if you look at the Christian church, particularly in America, while there may be people who can accept an old earth, there is a large fraction of those who even though they can accept an old earth, balk at the topic at crediting evolution, because they think they're being offered an entire physical and metaphysical package. I wonder if you could say a few
Yeah, well, I entirely agree with what you've said, that evolution has taken the form, if you like, of almost an overarching creator. Evolution has almost been given a mind, even though at the same time the atheists would say it's random and mindless. And so it's simply another example of scientism. That science has the only answers to the big questions of existence, and evolution is one of those things. The attitude in the States must also pick up from what I was quoting from John Dupre and Richard Dawkins, that somehow they believe that we believe in a God of the gaps, and it's not possible, therefore, if you understand a set of mechanisms, to think there might be a mind behind it. So evolution has become a sort of philosophy, and I call that evolutionism, and it's really a kind of branch of scientism where the worship of science or positivism has become, if you like, the kind of guiding force for understanding the way the universe works. And I reject it, and I think you may well be right that we need to do a bit more work in the States to show people that evolution is not the same as evolutionism.
I might just take one more question, and then I think we should have a 5-minute break, rather than go straight on to Jennifer's talk, so that we can, a couple of break or whatever, just to stretch our legs, and then we'll have Jennifer's talk. So maybe just one more question. That's
Can I just ask one more?
If it's brief.
Yes. Within the context of what we do, Jesus made that wonderful remark: "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and His righteousness, and all things shall be added unto you." How does that affect the way that do you consider what you do as part of that? I'm trying to understand the kingdom of heaven.
I sometimes say that as a prayer before. I don't have a lab anymore, but before we started working in the morning, I had a lab. Before I retired, and that would be a prayer, that seek you first the kingdom of God. But the kingdom of God simply is, if you like, doing God's stuff here on earth. It's the Lord's Prayer bit, Your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as in heaven. So basically, what I'm thinking is that if I'm looking at the work of the Creator, then, like Copernicus, I say that is the highest form of worship for me, because I'm taking joy in what the Creator has done. And in the way I do it, and in the way I talk to my colleagues, I try to be part of God's kingdom here, without any sense of arrogance, trying to be part of the presence of God's kingdom here. Does that make sense?
Good, thank you very much. Well, that's a great talk, John. And,